Good afternoon.
Hello to the participants of this excellent presentation. And if you could please change the slides for me, because this is my first experience with this application. Right, next slide, please. I don't want to explain standard or experimental science to you, especially before Professor Kitch gave you a general introduction into this. Instead, I would like to focus on presenting those issues where we looked at the problem of comprehension, or in fact the level of comprehension of non-standard science by drivers. What we wanted to see is regarding existing road signs on Polish roads, how easy to understand they are, which translates into how effective they are in conveying information to different groups of drivers. And number two, what should the road signs look like to be effective? Next slide, please. In terms of traffic signs comprehension and the study of that, I have to say there's been quite a lot of studies. This slide shows the key elements. Comprehension studies usually looked at standard signs. So ergonomically, what should signs look like, for example, or what should be the combination between text and symbols, or the colors of the sign, what should they be, how much information has to be on that sign to ensure that it's comprehensive, and contextual conditions which can improve comprehension or make it more difficult. There have been a lot of studies worldwide, both in African countries, in the East and in Europe. So many of the studies looked at psychosocial features involved in comprehension, so that's age, gender, driving experience, etc. The studies also looked at cultural factors, so new drivers, students, tourists, or foreigners driving in foreign countries. But there are also other studies from more recent years. There aren't many of those studies, but they've actually been conducted, and they looked at psychological aspects. For example, things such as cognition closure. This is a psychological phenomenon which happens during the process of cognition. So there may be some changes, perhaps, because this models the process of comprehension. In our study, we really focused on three main problems. Number one, in the case of non-standard signs and symbolic signs, are they more comprehensible than non-standard symbolic and textual signs? Number two, drivers perhaps came across similar signs, and this fact alone, does it help them with comprehension? And number three, and that's something I want to focus on in my presentation, well, can psychological changes be important drivers of comprehension? We used 3 tools. Well, we used signs. I'm going to share them with you shortly. And then we used questionnaires, looking really at 2 things. So we asked for some basic data such as age and gender. And part 2 of the questionnaire was designed to establish comprehension of the signs. So we would present the signs and then give several possible meanings of the signs. The participants were asked to look at the signs and then pick 1 from 8 or 9 possible answers. And obviously, 1 answer gave the full answer and identified the full meaning. The others only provided partial answers. And number 3, psychological studies, the 5-factor inventory. We thought that it would be a good idea to study personal traits of people, because we know from studies that psychological traits influence people's behavior and personality. We had 369 drivers involved in the study, most of them men, fewer women, across the ages and different driving status, different experience and education. The idea was to represent the groups in good proportion to get credible results. Now this slide shows you the results of the 4 groups of signs. So as I said, we divided the signs into symbolic, traffic control, and symbolic and textual traffic control signs, and symbolic signs that improve safety, and symbolic and textual signs that improve safety. So we have symbolic regulatory signs, symbolic warning signs, symbolic and text regulatory signs, symbolic and text warning signs. Well, the level of comprehension isn't really high, with the exception of several signs, mainly from the group of symbolic signs. Well, all the other signs, understanding them is really poor, not to say that it's really very poor. Next slide, please. What we wanted to establish is who or what group of drivers has a better understanding of the signs. And this is what I put on the slide. With the exception of symbolic regulatory signs, there were no differences between the genders. Men, and this is also confirmed in another study, men turned out to know better about the signs and they were more comprehensible. But when it comes to the other groups, so that's age, well, young drivers mainly had a better understanding of the signs, which was to be expected based on what we know about people's cognitive capacity. Experience. Well, higher experience, which is more kilometers driven. Education level, it didn't really matter and had no effect on understanding. When it comes to licenses people hold, well, usually ambulance drivers or driving instructors turned out to have a better comprehension of the signs, but that's mainly with symbolic signs, whether it's for traffic control or better safety. Next slide, please. Now this slide, as I said, we also looked at driver personality traits. The assumption was that they could be an important moderator of people's comprehension, and it was demonstrated that this is really the case. I illustrated this in this chart. The Big Five measures 5 major personality traits. A number of studies showed that personality features are predictor of risk-taking, alcohol consumption, or drink driving. But what the study showed was that high levels for the 5 personality traits are not really conducive to a good comprehension of science. Perhaps with the exception of symbolic regulatory science, where we in fact have 2 profiles of these driver groups. And then number 3, where we have low comprehension and very high on the features, and it's similar for symbolic and text regulatory science and symbolic and text warning signs. In terms of comprehension, due to driver personality traits, we didn't really find a lot of difference when it comes to symbolic and text warning signs, which is probably because symbolic and text warning signs really have too much information. As a result, that's how we are interpreting it, and we are testing this in new experiments. So we think that this really affects the level of comprehension. But the conclusion from it all is that personality traits of drivers are an important predictor of understanding. And the final slide, please. What are the practical conclusions from this? There are a few of them, and some of them have already been mentioned by Professor Kieć. So what I want to focus on is just a few recommendations. Well, we do need standard signs for a number of reasons, as discussed at this conference already. However, it's the form and content of science that's really important. It's very important because people's cognitive capacity is very limited. There is even a theory in psychology which says that people's brains are limited fourfold. I don't have the time to go further into this, but these are the things we have to consider because that's really important. But once we introduce a sign like this has to be preceded with some studies, whether it's pilot studies or questionnaires or surveys, to see whether the sign is comprehensible in the first place. And even when it is, then we also have to have some education around this, to show the meaning and the interpretation of the sign, because what we don't want is comprehension to be limited to just one piece of the sign, which is usually similar to other common signs or standard signs. I think I've already overrun. Sorry for that. Thank you.